Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Greener Arbitrations, the Path Towards Carbon Neutrality, organized by the Campaign for Greener Arbitrations North America Committee and generously hosted by the New York International Arbitration Center. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Campaigns for Greener Arbitrations websites. My name is Olivier André. I am Client Relationship Advisor in the International Arbitration Group of Freshfields in New York and the chair of the Campaign for Greener Arbitrations North America Committee. I'll have the pleasure of co-moderating this panel with Jessica Crow. Jessica is an independent arbitrator with York International, who specializes in energy and natural resources, climate change and the environment, general commercial disputes, and public international law. She is also a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, focused on the international climate change regime and governance of the energy transition. Jessica is president of the Young Canadian Arbitration Practitioners and sits on the North American Regional Subcommittee of the Campaign for Greener Arbitrations. I'd like to thank again the many arbitration institutions and organizations that are supporting today's event. And Jessica, on to you.
Thank you, Olivier. In today's webinar, we will discuss the carbon footprint of the arbitration community, the ins and outs of the voluntary carbon market, and discuss how arbitrators, arbitral institutions, arbitration practitioners, and other stakeholders can reduce and meaningfully offset their carbon emissions. So please feel free to use the chat function if you have any questions during the course of the webinar. If we don't get a chance to get to it during the course of the presentations, then we will do our best to try and get to them at the end. And before we get started, it's my pleasure to introduce Rekha Rangachari for welcome remarks. Rekha is the executive director of the New York International Arbitration Center. She's very actively involved in international arbitration, including serving as a member of the Campaign for Greener Arbitrations North America Regional Subcommittee and the Arbitral Institutions Subcommittee. Over to you, Rekha.
Thanks so much, both to Olivier and to Jessica and our esteemed experts on the line. Thanks also, of course, to each of you, our delegates who make sessions like this possible. NYIAC is thrilled to be able to serve as the remote host for this event. And as Jessica said, my name is Rekha Rangachari, Executive Director of NYIAC. Sessions like this help us as a community articulate new developments and dialogue on how to implement best practices. So please use the chat and Q&A functions liberally to share with us in real time and ask questions to our experts. I want to give a quick thanks as well, the holding slide that you see here, all of our supporting entities that really made this possible and help us get the word out. The Campaign for Greener Arbitrations launched in 2019, pre-pandemic, at a time when we had little idea how drastically the world would change. And in turn, we would pivot to using words like hybrid and remote in common parlance. In 2020, International Arbitrator Lucy Greenwood, ably at the helm, we gathered as a steering committee to draft the Green Protocols. 6 protocols that run the gamut on topics and stakeholders, including arbitral proceedings, hearings, conferences, and law firms, arbitration chambers, and arbitrators. I encourage you to visit with colleagues and friends on the protocols. We do it better as we come together in dialogue and figure out how best to implement. I give my sincere thanks to Olivier and Jessica for charting a thoughtful dialogue today, and back over to you both. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rekha. And now let's briefly introduce our panel of experts for today's webinar. Altera Etzel is Vice President, Client Solutions, US at Climate Impact Partners. Altera brings her experience working on corporate partnerships to protect natural resources and build sustainable economic development through powerful, impactful programs for clients around the world. Though she spends her days collaborating with some of the world's largest and best-known brands, she keeps it real by rearing a menagerie of animals on a farm outside of DC, including a very beautiful family of fainting goats. Rim Hamze is a senior advisor at WSP's Climate Change, Resilience and Sustainability Practice, where she leads climate change risk management and decarbonization projects. She has over 8 years of experience providing ESG and climate advisory services to private sector clients from industry to financial institutions with a focus on climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies, greenhouse gas accounting, and climate risk assessments. Rim is a professional engineer. She holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from McGill University and a master's degree in environmental impact assessment from Concordia University.
Next, we have Christopher Russo, who is the global head of Charles River Associates Energy Practice, where he leads a combined North American and European team. He's an energy economist and an expert on energy markets. And in addition to offering testimony in arbitrations and civil litigation, he also works extensively with the financial community in assessing investments in different energy markets worldwide. Based in Boston, he began his career as a power plant engineer and conducted his graduate studies at MIT, where he later served as a visiting scientist at the MIT Energy Laboratory studying decarbonization technologies. And next we have Mikey Bloxham, who is Freshfield's environment manager for responsible business and has been with the firm for 6.5 years. His role involves managing the delivery of the firm's global environmental strategy, ensuring Freshfields is meeting its ambitious environmental targets. And he also chairs the firm's Global Green Group, an employee-led network whose goal is to seek opportunities to run Freshfields offices as sustainably as possible. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. And in order to set the scene and kind of get into the subject matter, we thought the best way to start would be to have an overview of the carbon footprint of the international arbitration community and the work of the Campaign for Greener Arbitrations. So I'm going to start with a question to Olivier. Olivier, what is the carbon footprint of the international arbitration community?
Thanks, Jessica, and it is very significant. A while ago, the campaign did an initial study which estimated that about 20,000 trees, or the entire tree population of Central Park in New York, was necessary to offset the emissions of a mid-sized arbitration valued at $30 million. According to this study, the main source of carbon emissions was by far the travel to the hearing, followed by printing. You know, there's a lot of papers in legal proceedings. Recently, a study conducted by HSF showed that the carbon footprint of an in-person hearing in a mid-sized London-seated international arbitration was approximately 19 times more than the carbon footprint of a virtual hearing. The in-person hearing generated, according to the study, 111 tons carbon dioxide equivalent, compared to 6 for the virtual hearing. So we have a more concrete picture of the difference between the two. It is the difference is equivalent to the average amount of CO2 generated by 15 people in the EU in an entire year. So it's true that these studies rely on certain assumptions, and the campaign is currently working on additional research to better guide the community. But these two studies still show that the arbitration community has a tremendous carbon footprint, mainly due to traveling. In addition to cases and the travel to for these cases, the community also generates a significant carbon footprint due to the many conferences that are organized every year, as we know, in the international arbitration community.
So Olivier, can you then tell us what the Campaign for Greener Arbitrations has developed in terms of its Green Pledge and the Green Protocols that can be implemented in arbitrations?
Yeah, so the campaign launched a Green Pledge in 2020 to encourage individuals within the arbitration community to do their part to reduce the carbon footprint by adopting sustainable behaviors, such as avoiding printing and traveling, increasing the use of video conferencing, etc. And I'm pleased to report that the pledge has garnered a lot of support. We have recently reached the 1,000th signatory milestone, which is quite significant. In 2021, the campaign launched green protocols, as Rika mentioned in her welcome remarks. These protocols are more granular, a more granular set of sustainable guidelines targeted at the different stakeholders of the arbitration community, so law firms, conference organizers, institutions, etc.
Great, thank you, and thank you to Reka as well for posting the links to the protocols and the pledge in the chat. For those of you who are unfamiliar, you can have a look at them. You can have a look at them from the website. And so then, Olivia, just in terms of the green procedural order, which I know is something that the campaign spent a lot of time working on and developing, can you maybe give us a little bit of an outline of that and explain how that can be implemented in arbitrations going forward?
Yes, so the protocol for arbitral proceedings encourages parties to adopt green measures for their individual arbitration, either in their arbitration agreement or in procedural order number 1 at the time of the pre-hearing conference. Tribunals are also encouraged to discuss the adoption of green measures with the parties at the pre-hearing conference. The measures suggested in the green model, in the model green procedural order, which I'd like to note, can be adopted in whole or in part, include, for example, considering virtual rather than in-person hearings or electronic rather than paper bundles. I'm being very short here because I want to get into the the core of the discussion today. We've had many seminars and about the topic, and I invite everyone to look at the links that were provided in the chat, to get more details about the different protocols and the model procedural order.
Great, thank you so much, Olivier. Well, now that we have a better sense of the work that the campaign is doing, the protocols, the model procedural order, which all encourage arbitration stakeholders to actually change their behaviors. Another thing that the campaign also advocates for is to offset any arbitration-related emissions. But of course, that's the topic of our panel today. So in the next part of our program, we're going to turn to our expert panel, who will explain what greenhouse gas emissions are. We're really going to get down to brass tacks, how they're measured, how they're attributed, and what firms, institutions, and individuals can do to offset their emissions and to have confidence in the offsets that they're purchasing. So I think the best place to start is the very beginning. And my first question is for Reem. Why should businesses measure their greenhouse gas emissions?
Great question, Jessica. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing globally today is from climate change, with some of the highest risks that we're facing, including extreme weather events, but also, more importantly, the failure of climate change mitigation adaptation. So the Paris Agreement was set by countries across the world, basically as a limit average global warming to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, so by 2100, and to pursue efforts to limit that warming further to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and with the intent really to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. And accounting for greenhouse gas emissions is really the first step towards achieving the emissions reductions that are required by the Paris Agreement, because you can't really manage what you don't measure. And as such, organizations really need to be accounting for their greenhouse gas emissions before they can start thinking about mitigating them. And in order to do this, they first need to do is building a greenhouse gas inventory. So that basically, what greenhouse gases are they emitting, how much, from which sources. Once they've done that, once they've measured their emissions, they can then decide, which emissions they're going to offset. They can then set greenhouse gas reduction targets, and then they can continue to monitor their progress towards achieving these targets over time. So it's really a continuous process with the whole greenhouse gas measurement.
Thanks. That's a really helpful place to start. And I think another linked question to that is related to carbon neutrality. Whenever we talk about carbon neutrality and across a certain time horizon, either to 2030 or to 2050, we often see the different types of emissions categorized into different scopes. Can you explain a little bit more about these scopes and what they represent?
Yes, absolutely. So the concepts of scopes really comes from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the main protocol that is used for greenhouse gas measurement and accounting. There are 3 types of scopes, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, and I'll go into a little bit more detail for each. So Scope 1 are basically direct emissions from sources that are owned and or controlled by a company. So for example, fuel combustion from company-owned vehicles or fuel combustion in on-site boilers for heating buildings. That would be categorized as Scope 1. Scope 2 are all indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy. So that would include purchased utilities like electricity, steam, heat, chilled water. Also includes things and heating services, if we're more familiar with these terms. Then scope 3 is basically all other indirect emissions from a company's value chain. And there are 15 scope 3 categories that cover and downstream activities. Cover all of the 15 categories because it's quite extensive, but maybe I'll provide some examples just to give some context. That refers back to kind of what Olivier mentioned earlier about the arbitration community is purchased goods and services. So those are emissions from the upstream extraction, production, and transportation of goods and services that are purchased by a company. So for example, paper that is used in offices or paper that is used for the legal procedures. Another one is capital goods, which again, is very similar to purchased goods and services, but is referring to capital goods rather than purchased goods and services. And for example, office furniture that you would purchase. Other examples could be generated in operations. So all the emissions that are related to the disposal and treatment of the waste that is generated by a company. Business travel, another very important one for the arbitration community, as Olivier mentioned. So that would relate to emissions from the transportation of employees for business-related activities more specifically. So using air travel, using rail, and so on. And one last one, and then I'll stop, is employee commuting, for example. So that's really the emissions from the transportation of employees between their homes and their work office.
That's quite a lot. So
there are many more.
Yeah. When a company, a firm, an institution is trying to wrap its head around all 3 scopes of its emissions and to understand its global carbon footprint, how exactly do they measure these emissions? Can you help us maybe understand that a little bit better?
It can be quite a complex process, but I'll just maybe try to give some simplified approach and the way to think about it. The first step is really to collect the activity data. So all that data about those different sources of emissions that we're talking about. So for example, the annual amount of electricity consumption for an office. You know, that's a source of emissions and that's the activity data that you're collecting. Or another one, the amount of paper that is purchased or the amount of spend that you've spent on paper purchases as well. There could be different sources that you can use. And then once you have that activity data, you would then multiply the activity amount by an emission factor that is relevant for that source. And basically emission factors are used to transform this activity data into estimated greenhouse gas emissions. So those are generally published by governmental organizations. A lot of them are made publicly available. Some are for purchase commercially, but I won't get into those details. But one thing that's important to know about emission factors is that it's really important to select an emission factor for the activity, location, of the assessment. So an emission factor for stationary combustion will be different than an emission factor for mobile combustion, even if the same fuel type is being used. And then for electricity, for example, emission factors change from year to year because as the grid gets cleaner, the emission factor might change as a result of that and become lower per kilowatt hour, let's say. And if we take maybe an example of air travel, because I know that's something that's a hot topic for the arbitration community, and we start to think about emission factors and how they might vary and how you make decisions according to that. Generally speaking, for air travel, emission factors are in units of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per passenger mile, let's say. And then the emission factors themselves vary based on the haul distance and the flight class. So they're different depending on those categories. So for example, emissions from a long haul flight, let's New York to Singapore, is on average going to be 20% lower in emissions than a short haul flight. So one that, let's say from New York to Boston. So that makes you think, like, for a short distance flight, it might make more sense to travel by rail or bus compared to a longer distance flight, just as an example. And then when we're looking at long haul flights, the emission factors, let's say for a first class ticket, are going to be almost 40 or 50% larger than that of a business class ticket. So again, emission factors can help drive and support decision making, selecting the types of travel. And just one last thing on calculating the emissions that I forgot to mention before going into those examples is after you've multiplied the activity data by an emission factor, generally emission factors are available by type of greenhouse gas, but sometimes available in carbon dioxide equivalent. But when they're not, have to multiply the greenhouse gas by its global warming potential so as to convert it into the carbon dioxide equivalent. And the global warming potential is basically a measure of how much heat each gas traps into the atmosphere relative to carbon dioxide. So for example, carbon dioxide is going to have a global warming potential of 1 because it's being used as the reference gas. Methane is about 28 times more potent, so 28 times larger than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide is about 265 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Recognize that's maybe a bit more detail than we need to get into, but it's also important to kind of recognize that not all greenhouse gases are equal as well.
Thank you. That's really, that's really helpful just to understand as a, as the basis of what we start to do this calculation. And I think that your examples are really helpful, particularly for the arbitration community. And I have another question related to that, which is about the digital footprint. I know that a lot of us in the arbitration world have considered that the switch to virtual has potentially reduced our carbon footprint, but it's really difficult to actually understand whether it has, and if so, by how much. And so I think it would be helpful to understand how is it calculated. But for example, if we run a virtual hearing versus one that's in person.
Sure. Again, it all comes down really to identifying the activity sources that generate the emissions. So for example, if we're talking about a hearing that is being held virtually, that might include emissions from participants using, basically powering the computers during the meeting. So the electricity that's used to power the computers, that's part of the emissions profile, or the electricity needed to power the internet and used to host the meetings. And some of these items are a little bit more complex to quantify, even for very seasoned greenhouse gas professionals. It's definitely a little bit more complex when it comes to that digital footprint. If we look on the other hand to more of those in-person meetings or hearings, those things that, like Olivier mentioned, for example, the travel to the site, which can include air travel, rail travel, rental cars, if you're driving from the airport to the site hearing, or taxis as well, if you're using those modes of transport. Also, another thing is probably accommodation. Generally, hearings I expect are over many days. So all the emissions that are associated with hotel stays, the packages that are printed that already talked about, that's definitely part. Obviously, things like the waste that is generated from catering. So I assume there might be coffee, water, and food at those hearings and associated meetings as well. And then any emissions related to, let's say, deliveries to the hearing location and so on. So it would really vary based on what is involved in each hearing. But you can see that there's a lot more sources related to that compared to a virtual setting, for sure.
Right. And so I guess as tech starts to green their grid, the gap will start to widen as well.
Exactly.
One of the I know that was one of the big takeaways from COP26 was where there were major commitments from the big tech companies that they would be running on green energy going forward. So that will be, I think, will have a significant impact on the virtual hearing world. Thank you so much, Reem. I'm going to turn over to you, Olivier.
Yeah, and thanks for all these explanations, Reem. Now that we all know how to measure emissions, at least more or less, what we'd like to understand, and I'll turn this question to Chris, is in a nutshell, can you explain to us what is carbon offsetting and what is the carbon market?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And by the way, Reem, thank you for that explanation. I learned a few things, and I also feel obliged to mention I always take the train when I go to New York. So briefly, Olivier, and that's a good question. And so carbon offsetting and the carbon market are two distinctly different concepts. So I'll take them in that sequence. Carbon offsetting is essentially when a party decides that they will emit a certain amount of carbon and they'd like to offset it. And that offsets fall broadly into two separate categories, the first being avoidance, the second being removal, and the latter is distinctly less common. And then somebody goes out sort of their own volition and decides that they're going to buy an offset from somebody. It could be a private party. It could be a semi-standardized product, which has been certified by any number of agencies, or it could be a purely bilateral transaction. But in one way or another, a price is agreed, and then an offset is purchased that in most cases avoids carbon emissions from some other source. And so perhaps an airline could decide, and there's sort of a program for this, an airline could decide that they want to offset the emissions from air travel. They could go out through a broker or a bilateral transaction and make an investment that avoids some emission of carbon elsewhere in the world or in the same location. And so carbon offsets in general tend to be more voluntary rather than mandatory, although there are certain programs, there's a bit of a gray area as to whether voluntary or mandatory offsets or voluntary programs or markets can coexist. Now, the carbon market is something else. And in my mind, I draw a distinction because the carbon market is typically comprised of both voluntary and mandatory credits. Offsets typically are voluntary. Credits or sort of items of value that represent carbon emissions are often traded in carbon markets. Some of these can be mandatory, some of them can be voluntary. May expand on that a bit later. But in one way or another, there is a price assigned for emissions of carbon. And in most cases, these credits are tradable among market participants or between the central exchange and back. It's actually, people sort of forget that market forces to reduce emissions is not a new concept. People are probably most familiar with this because of ETS and other carbon programs, but they've existed for some time for the emissions of sulfur dioxide, for nitrogen oxides in other geographies and elsewhere throughout the world. But fundamentally, it is an idea that market forces and the tendency of economic actors to be profit maximizing can figure out the best solution to reduce carbon by making investments which increase their profitability and increase their returns. And in many cases, but not always, the price of the credit or the price of the carbon equivalent is determined through market forces and what the avoided cost is and the particular willingness to pay of some of those market participants. And I should probably stop there because I could probably go on for hours about the dynamics of these markets.
Well, thanks. That's very, very interesting. So I understand that there is a voluntary carbon market and a compliance market, and maybe I'll turn this question to Altera. Can you tell us, Altera, a little bit more about that and what's the difference between the two?
Sure. So I'm just going to kind of dovetail off of what Reem and Chris already said, and thanks for having me today. After you've kind of got your measurements in place and you're able to understand your emissions from a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalency, then whether you're a voluntary or a compliance buyer, you can go out into the market and, to Chris's point, mitigate for an emission producing activity in a different place than where that emission was actually produced. I'll tell you some ways that the compliance and voluntary market are quite similar, which is, for example, a forest is a forest and a tree is a tree. The fundamental technology of trapping carbon in nature is going to be the same for the compliance buyer and the voluntary buyer. However, the compliance buyer is regulated to do so. There's a regulatory act that they're required to comply with. Oftentimes, these are, power companies and kind of the larger emitters, whereas on the voluntary side, this is a self-defined commitment and a self-defined goal. Another probably key distinction is the area in which the offsets are derived from. So a compliance credit, to Chris's point, is going to be either national or regional specific. He mentioned the ETS, which is the European Union's emission trading scheme. That's one in the EU. In the United States, we have something called RGGI, that's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that's up in the Northeast. We also have the California Cap and Trade Market, which, while it was started in California, has actually linked with Quebec's system. So, functionally, they're very similar, but the kind of motivations behind them are quite different. If you had asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said there is an incredible price difference between an offset for a voluntary buyer versus a credit for a compliance buyer. We're really seeing that the pricing for both, the lines are a bit blurry now. Pricing is actually quite similar for both, and we're actually seeing more and more as demand goes up in the voluntary market, that they can tap those compliance credits and purchase them to meet their own voluntary obligations. Whereas the reverse is not necessarily true. A compliance buyer is not going to be able to buy just any offset to meet a regulatory act. So I'm just going to keep it brief and stop there and hope that kind of builds on what Reem and Chris already discussed.
Thanks, Altera. This is crystal clear to me, which is fantastic. So what is the price of a ton of carbon, and how is it set? And you've kind of like explained that there is not so much of a difference those days around the prices on both. But so what is the price, and how is that set exactly?
If I can jump in here, oh, sorry. I will. Just picking up on what you said, Altera. The arbitrage in carbon markets has been a very interesting economic dynamic that has emerged in the last several years. Arbitraging between voluntary and compliance markets, and arbitraging between compliance markets. This is a topic which 5 years ago nobody had ever mentioned, and now increasingly comes up. So, but how is the price set? It's two very different answers. Typically in a voluntary market, it's essentially willingness to pay, and the products are much less standardized. They can be certified by different agencies. They can be avoidance, they can be removal, but it's fundamentally what a buyer is willing to pay, although there are some brokers in the middle. It's a much more heterogeneous market than it would be for compliance credits. And frankly, the willingness to pay these days is often determined by shareholders, who increasingly are exerting more influence in order to hold companies to their decarbonization requirements. There are some companies who are not terribly willing to spend money on this, and others who have a great deal of pressure to be fully carbon neutral. Compliance credits are much more straightforward in some ways, because there's a centralized exchange. There is a pool of credits, which in many cases is reduced over time, forcing market participants to become more efficient, and they can trade these among themselves. And in many cases, the price can converge to an avoided cost of carbon or an administrative compliance penalty as well. But it is an effective means for reducing carbon, and the effectiveness, to some extent, it depends on the pool of credits available, the embedded cost of carbon in the market, and the willingness of regulators to enforce compliance.
So what's the price? Like, how much does it cost? To be very concrete and to give an idea to the participants.
Oh gosh, I think Reggie markets are probably somewhere around $15 per ton of carbon in the Northeast as a rough number. ETS is probably trading a bit above that, although it does tend to bounce around a lot more. I will say, there's a big question: is that enough? And the question I always have to that is, it's better than zero. The higher the cost of carbon, the greater the impact it has on the market. Anecdotally, I will say that with the majority of professionals in the investment community that I've spoken with over the last several years, there is a belief that this price is likely to increase materially over time, for what it's worth. So that's what the people who are investing the capital think these days.
And maybe I'll just jump in on the voluntary side. It's going to be a much wider range depending on the project type. If we're talking about large scale wind power, if you're talking about efficient cook stoves, for example, in Eastern Africa, or if you're talking about restoring or protecting forests. And kind of each of those categories will have different price ranges, ranging from $10 to $50. The one thing that the voluntary market cares a lot more about than the compliance market is something that we call co-benefits, which will add a premium onto the cost of that carbon offset. So co-benefits, think of those in terms of maybe how they align with the Sustainable Development Goals. Things like gender equality or clean water or no poverty. The more that a project kind of ticks co-benefits boxes, the more there is a willingness to pay a higher premium for it, to Chris's point.
Okay, great, interesting. So there are on the voluntary market different carbon offset programs, as I understand it. And so Altera, can you tell us a little bit about the hallmarks of a quality carbon offsets, and what kind of program exists, what kind of programs exist to offset these emissions?
Sure. So I just mentioned kind of a number of different offset project types, but they all have a few things in common. One of the things they have in common is something called additionality. And basically, in order for a project to be additional, it means that the project could not have existed without the contribution of that climate finance. Another kind of seemingly obvious hallmark would be measuring. And kind of like corporates are trying to measure their own emissions with a baseline, so they understand, these are our emissions to start, this is where we need to reduce, this is where we need to offset. The same thing kind of applies to a carbon project. In order to measure what's being reduced, avoided, or removed, we need to know what the baseline scenario is, and it needs to be against an approved methodology, whether that's Climate Action Reserve and American Carbon Registry here in the United States, Vera, VCS, gold standards in other parts of the world. The offset has to be permanent, meaning that there's a guarantee that that reduction actually happened. The question I always get is, well, if I support this forestry project on the West Coast in the United States, what happens if the forests burn? And I can confidently kind of answer, no, your offset is permanent because every project has to set aside what they call a buffer pool. So if for any reason the project fails, there's a replacement offset that's still going to be permanent to your claim of reduction, avoidance, removal. Another hallmark is that it's unique. So it's tracked in a registry. Within that registry, there's a serial number that's attributed to each metric tons. And that means that you can avoid something called double counting, which folks might have heard of in the marketplace. How do I know that this metric ton is attributed to my claim and is not being claimed by any other company? That's that unique registry serial number. And then finally, extremely important, it has to be independently verified, meaning that a third-party auditor has to be on site to ensure that the project was designed properly, is delivering the outcomes that it set out to, and is adhering to whatever methodology and standard that the project was designed to.
Thank you, Altera. Jessica, I think we have other questions around this.
I'll jump in now. So thank you. Thank you so much for setting that out. I think a question that I have is relates to prices, but also to the quality offset. So once a company has identified a quality offset that bears the hallmarks, additionality, all of the criteria that you just set out, then a natural instinct, I assume, would be to find the best deal, to find the best price in the market. So I guess the question, and this touches on something that Chris raised earlier, is whether the price of the offsets are they appropriately priced in order to incentivize people to actually change their behavior? Because one of the functions of a regulated market, of the ETS, for example, is in order to encourage abatement amongst those actors who find the cost of purchasing carbon credits to be too high, and so it will incentivize them to change their business practices. Is the price of carbon in the voluntary market appropriately priced to do the same thing, for example, to make someone think twice about that flight from New York to Boston? And so I'll hand that one over to you, Chris.
That's a good question. But an adjacent question, what you asked is certainly you noted correctly that compliance markets have been very effective in getting people to change their behavior. When it comes to voluntary credits, I do think there's a very strong overlap between the universe of people who want to reduce their emissions anyway, and the universe of people who are likely to engage in offset trading. With the lack of uniformity and heterogeneity in the voluntary offset market, it's difficult to sort of measure. It's difficult to sort of measure the impact. I mean, I've seen charges for, you know, if you're flying to London or something like that, that sometimes there can be a charge there. If I put on my economist hat, any company who is buying voluntary offsets, in some way that cost is being passed on to its consumers. You know, does it incentivize consumers to frequent companies or entities which buy those offsets? I think for at least some segment of the consumer market, it does. I think it's not quite as effective as mandatory. It's not quite as effective as mandatory compliance credits at the moment. It is in incentivizing that behavior. But in some ways, it is the participants in the voluntary market who are choosing to make the investment, and then consumers sort of incur the costs. And it is, again, it's to your point, is it high enough to incentivize behavior? It is. I think it probably is, because it is a price that is sufficient one for investors to make these decisions to buy these voluntary credits. So, but measuring that is fiendishly difficult, as you may sort of be inferring at the moment.
Yeah, that was very, very much to the point that I was trying to make. And I mean, although it's interesting that there are many companies, as you noted, who are voluntarily doing this because of there is the anticipation that they may soon fall under the regulated market. So there is, it is prudent to really start to anticipate building in these costs into your corporate strategy, into your operating costs, with the idea that one day they may be compulsory. So I think that oh, sorry. I think I was
going to say, if you're in the market, I think a lot of people are going long on carbon because there is that strong belief that at some point this is going to become mandatory and is going to become a material cost.
Yeah, and so this leads really well actually into the next segment, which is about what law firms, corporations, and arbitral institutions can do to be carbon neutral. And we have a brilliant example from Freshfields, which has been carbon neutral since 2007. And we have Mikey here who can tell us about their environmental strategy and share details on the offsetting projects that they've selected. So I'll turn over to you, Mikey, to let us know about that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm always very excited to talk about Freshfields' environmental strategy and our offsetting program. I think it's great. I'll start off with the environmental strategy. As you've mentioned, the firm's been carbon neutral since 2007, and continually it's setting up targets to reduce consumption and cut waste. In 2016, we set some targets in a few key areas, and that was to do with our energy supply, paper usage, and business-related travel, which is our biggest area for emissions. We successfully met those targets, and in 2021, we set a new 5-year environmental strategy, and that continues on the success of the previous targets that we set. One of these is to sign up to RE100, which is a commitment to have all of our offices supplied with 100% renewable energy by 2030 is the date we've set. We want to make a further reduction on business-related travel. We want to phase out single-use plastics in all offices, and we're hoping that will be done by the end of this year. We just have a bit of a surplus left over from COVID-related purchases, basically. And then we also have an employee-led global green group, and I'm the chair for that. And we have colleagues from all of our offices globally who take part in that, and we share best practices and give advice on how to run our offices more efficiently. But we also do signposting and raise awareness, and we've recently done an educational campaign called Freshfields Earth Month, and that ran from International Day of Forests up until Earth Day. And we've run a host of events. So I delivered a few on carbon offsetting, and we've had a speaker in from the Landscape Finance Lab to talk about biodiversity and then the work that their company does. And we've had an event today on mental health and well-being, and that included the benefits of nature. So we try to raise awareness of all these things with colleagues. My role also involves working with different departments and teams. So I've been working with Olivier on how we might reduce the carbon footprint of our arbitrations, but I also work with benefits team and graduate recruitment, marketing on how we can have more sustainable events, and also with the procurement team and their sustainable procurement strategy. And of course, we report on our carbon footprint every year to the UNGC and try and reduce it as much as possible. And I'd like to tell you about our offsetting project, which we've called Freshfields REAP. And in 2015, we decided that rather than make an annual purchase to offset our carbon, we would actually commit to a 10-year project that we could support to offset our business-related emissions. And we worked with a consultancy in the UK called Natural Capital Partners, and they helped us select an appropriate program to invest in. And we've selected it's a carbon removal program, actually, rather than avoidance. So we've gone with a reforestation program in Uganda and Kenya. And the company, the project is called TIST, which stands for the International Small Tree Planting Program. And it's run by the Clean Air Action Corporation. So we renamed it Freshfields REAP, which is Reforestation in East Africa program. And we work with Natural Capital Partners and the Clean Air Action Corporation to set out a strategy for the 10 years and to set some KPIs that we hope to achieve within those 10 years. And in a nutshell, it's a reforestation program, and the funds from these purchased credits support local farmers and their communities. So farmers effectively get money for planting trees. The more trees they have, the older and the larger the trees, the more money they'll receive. And what's great about the project is that there's a profit sharing aspect to this as well. And aside from that, the trees that are planted are quite often fruit trees, so that produces food for the communities and the farmers, and they can sell these at markets as well for extra income. Each group of farmers, we call it a cluster, and there's 10 to 12 people in the group. There's a rotating leadership model as well, so women have the opportunity to lead these groups, and then they can deliver training to other clusters as well, and encourage other farmers to buy into the project as well. So this expands the clusters and the communities, which is really great. The trees that are planted, of course, sequester the carbon, but it also restores the landscape, and that improves the soil quality and the groundwater levels as well, which can help protect the land if there's floods or if there's drought. I've mentioned that the fruits can be sold at markets, and that brings in further income, and of course the profits that go to the farmers as well. And also what's quite good about our offsetting scheme is that aside from offsetting business travel, all colleagues and partners globally can offset their personal emissions as well. In the UK, we're able to do that through our monthly payroll. We're hoping that will be the case in the US as well. But in any case, all of our colleagues can do that. There's a calculator where you can put in your diet and your travel, holiday plans and things like that. And it suggests to you what you should offset for the year. So that's really great. And those credits go towards Freshfields REAP and a clean cook stove program in India. Altera mentioned reasons we selected this program. It wasn't solely about the carbon sequestering, but it's also a community impact and investment that's involved in that, the gender equality for the leadership. It also aligns with our responsible business goals and commitments that we have, and the reforestation aspect links in with our paper consumption. Freshfields REAP and TIST touch upon almost all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. We've got climate action, life on land, gender equality, the quality education as well. The money that the farmers get helps them to put the children in education, also the training that the farmers receive, the profit sharing. This tackles poverty and hunger as well. So it's a really great scheme. We invited some of the farmers to our London office. I think it was 2017 or 2018. And one of the farmers, Patricia Gichiru, she said that the project has lifted their livelihoods, which is wonderful to know because it just has such a great impact in so many areas. The project as well, I'll just add, it had a triple gold certification as well last year for the massive benefits it's had on community, climate and biodiversity. So we're really proud that Freshfields has been supporting that programme. The main challenges that Freshfields is facing in reducing its carbon footprint are probably the same as many other professional service companies. There's the general office running emissions, so paper usage, single-use items, heating and that kind of thing, water, waste, and business travel, which is a major emitter. And it probably accounts for almost half of our annual emissions, apart from last year, which was due to COVID, but generally it's around half our emissions. So we really need to get that down as much as possible. We in offices where we are still so for example, Manchester, to help with our waste, we have vegware now. So all of our kind of packaging in the canteen, that goes to an anaerobic digestion site in Manchester as well. So that's really helped bring down our waste that's going to landfill or incineration. And our focus is to reduce our emissions, but without any cost to service to our clients. So business travel is often quite necessary, but we try and engage with clients and say that we'd like to use green protocols or try and handle the matter as sustainably as possible. And some clients are very happy to work with us on that. And our future steps to reduce emissions will continue working against the targets that we've set. We've also submitted to the Science Based Targets Initiative, and we will have these validated later this year. And there's a big queue, so if you're wanting to do it, you need to get them submitted as soon as possible, because so many companies are really keen to do that. Our targets that we've set are quite similar to our environmental commitments, but there's also one regarding our supply chain as well. And we're hoping to be able to get a network of suppliers who are also committed to the Science Based Targets Initiative. And further to that, we've also purchased some new carbon credits to take us through the next decade, hopefully. And these are for a number of different projects, including global renewable energy and the efficient Gyapa cook stoves in Ghana, a gas network leak reduction in Bangladesh, and finally, a sustainable rubber tree plantation in Guatemala. And these are all great offsetting programs, and we'll be communicating these out to colleagues and our clients over the next few weeks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mikey.
About how wonderful Freshfield's program is. So when he says Natural Capital Partners, it's actually a Climate Impact Partners company, which is a reflection of a merge between Natural Capital Partners and Climate Care. And you keep probably hearing removals versus avoidance. I think I would just say a quick note on what that means. Removals is taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and avoidance is ensuring that a ton isn't kind of emitted to begin with. There's a big emphasis on removals, and Freshfields just had this wonderful foresight because the best way to achieve a removal is by planting a tree. And in order for that tree to do its work, it needs time to grow. And as the whole market turns this focus into removals, Freshfields is kind of saying, yeah, we did that more than 10 years ago. So our trees are actually doing a significant amount of the work that they set out to. Including, and I don't know if you all know this, but Microsoft is also one of our accounts and followed in your climate leadership footsteps to also support the TIST program. So, back to kind of what did the tech companies commit to and what are they doing? Well, indeed, they are a bit following leaders like Freshfields.
Yeah, that was a really excellent overview. Thank you so much, Mikey, for setting that out for all of us. It really shows what can be done when these initiatives are undertaken at the company level and the widespread impact that they can have for employees, for clients, and also I can imagine this is probably important for your recruitment as well. I'm sure the next generation are really, this is really on their radar when they're thinking about where they want to work. So it's a really excellent overview for all of us to understand how this can be replicated, particularly at a firm level. We do have
one. Just quickly say as well, we had some students that we were speaking to last week that were doing some presentations for us, and they've all said they're very interested in seeing it on company websites and hope it will be easier to find. But it's something that I think that age group are finding quite important when they're going to be applying for jobs in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question from the audience, which we could turn to now. It's from Kevin Setiadi in the Q&A, and it's about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the question is about what is the opinion of the panel regarding the CBAM policy currently implemented by the EU? Does applying such policies indeed reduce the carbon emissions, or will it not be effective because businesses can just change their target market where no carbon policy is enforced? And so just to refresh for anyone who's not familiar, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is something that was contemplated and will be implemented by the European Union. It's intended to close carbon leakages, and it is effectively it's impactful for those goods that are being imported into the EU that are not sufficiently taxed carbon tax at the source. Any difference will be applied as a border adjustment mechanism as it's imported into the EU. And so, for example, things like steel, aluminium, things that are raw materials that are used in construction projects that are imported from jurisdictions that don't sufficiently tax them at the source, there will be you'll see some impact there. So I'll turn this over if any of our panelists would like to respond. It is a little. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say just one or two thoughts, and I have not been following the carbon border adjustment mechanism day to day. But as with any of the program, much of the impact depends upon the final design and where it's going to be. I know direct versus indirect emissions was going to be a big factor, and in scenarios like that, production of access to cheap primary energy had a significant impact on who were sort of the winners and who were the losers. Also, the classification of direct and indirect emissions when it came to consumption is going to affect kind of where there may be sort of winners and losers, and people may shift their production. As with any programs, typically the expect the unexpected, and the ultimate impacts may be not exactly what's intended. But I think I will say that there is some work on our website about the carbon border adjustment mechanism and some commentary, but there will undoubtedly be ways where there are unanticipated effects depending on the final design of the program.
Yeah. And if I may just add to that, also just to the point about the target market, I think that if you're talking about importing materials for something like an infrastructure project, it's not going to be very easy to change the location of an infrastructure project. If you're talking about building a railway or telecoms infrastructure, if that's happening in the EU and the materials are coming from somewhere else, it's probably more likely that they will be sourced from somewhere else rather than the target market being shifted. But absolutely, to be seen what the impact will be.
I'm certain that's the case. Regulatory arbitrage, right?
So we have another question from the audience, which will tie in nicely with the last segment of our discussion, which we'll go to in a minute. But one of the participants would like to know from you if there are any third-party accreditors certifications that individuals can use as reliable indicators of credible offset providers. And there is TerraPass, which is mentioned as an example.
Sure, I'll take it. I would say my best advice would be come to me. But beyond that would be to look at an organization called ICROA. It's the International Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Alliance. So any offset provider that is a member of ICROA is going to be audited for ICROA's code of conduct. And so Natural Capital Partners, Climate Care, and others are part of that ICROA alliance. And I think that that would be a great way to just kind of ground truth that, that as a provider, we're following industry best practices as set out by the ICROA body. That would be my easiest, quickest answer.
Thank you. Any other insights from the other panelists on this? No. Okay, Altera, we'll go to you and consult the ICROA website. So the next part of our program is really, what's next for the arbitration communities? What can the arbitration community do to practically offset its emissions? And one of the big first question that I have is that is about arbitration conferences. The campaign, excuse me, the campaign organized a workshop last October on the future of international arbitration conferences and training, where we had over 100 participants from over 60 arbitration institutions worldwide discussing, what has happened during the pandemic and the development of remote and hybrid conferences, and all of this. And so we share these best practices recently on our website, encouraging the community as we get out of the pandemic, to remember the great things that we've been doing during the pandemic, even though sometimes it was not very pleasant because we couldn't meet our friends, etc. But having remote hearings has had also an important positive impacts on access to knowledge, diversity, etc. on our communities. So I've heard Altera that there are ways that even if you do an in-person conferences, you can make it carbon neutral. And I'd like to, for you to give us a little bit more information about that to inspire our community, which, as I said at the very beginning, is a huge organizer, of many hundreds of events worldwide, where everybody, the practitioners, etc., converge, by the hundreds every week.
Sure, maybe I can bring it full circle for the wrap up. So to Reem's point, it all starts with measurement. She already talked about a little bit of what event measurements look like. It's direct emissions from the venue, what your conference space electricity is producing, what your hotel rooms are producing, things like that. Then you're going to account for travel. Air and attendee travel is going to be the highest part of the footprint, but would also include taxi transfers, car rentals, anybody that commuted there or got there by rail. And then finally, waste disposal. Once you have the data from what the event footprint emission producing activities is, you can turn that into a metric ton of carbon equivalent. So you know the carbon footprint of your event. And then you can move on to looking to offsetting projects like some of the great ones that Mikey mentioned. And you would purchase the equal amount of carbon offsets in metric tons to match the carbon footprint of the event based on all those emission producing activities, and thereby make it a carbon neutral event.
Okay, that sounds very simple, but if I have to organize a conference tomorrow, it sounds actually quite complicated because I have to go to the measurement, I have to kind of like try to figure it out. I mean, is there, like, again, I guess it goes back to the same question as we've asked before, is there some kind of company, I mean, you or others, that I'm a conference organizer, I want to organize a big conference, I want to make it carbon neutral, where do I go, how do I do it, like concretely? Because I don't, Reka at the New York International Arbitration Center can do many things, but I can't imagine that she would be, able to easily do that for the next, New York International Arbitration Week, for example.
If it's easy and or small, choose a venue that provides that carbon footprint for you. More and more hotels and conferences are going to have that information for you. They won't be able to know what your air travel is. You're going to have to figure that out through a series of expense reports and self-reporting. But conferences and hotels understand that folks want to know the footprint of their events. If it's something quite large, or in a conference center that doesn't have that carbon footprint, I would recommend you probably call WSP, and they will get to doing the measurements that Reem talked about. So it's probably, which will probably be a combination of the both, getting information that's available from the venue and then figuring out an easy way to survey the attendees to understand what the travel impact is. I did simplify it, and it sounds complicated, but I have to be honest, it is really not that hard to figure this out. And with some really basic spreadsheets or some basic questions from attendees, you can get this information, crunch the numbers, and have a carbon footprint to offset.
Right. But so there's no company that you can go to and basically say, I want this event, to be, to have some kind of label. This is a carbon neutral event. Help me from A to Z, basically, to calculate and to offset.
Yeah, we do have a protocol called the carbon neutral protocol that has carbon neutral certified events, where if a WSP measured your event's footprints and we had a footprint, and then we knew that you were offsetting it with high quality, what we call ICROA approved offsets like Freshfields is, then you would be able to carry our mark of a carbon neutral certified event.
Great. Okay, so when you say you mean your company, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
climate
okay.
impact partners, in this case, the natural capital partners piece of climate impact partners.
Okay, great. And so maybe we can provide some information after the program on this, because I suspect that this could be of interest to the community, which is organizing major events, you know, with hundreds of people, literally. So that might be interesting. The next and final question, which we can have kind of a discussion around, is, you know, in terms of so, you know, arbitration community besides events, how can, you know, and I'd like to have a little bit of a discussion around, you know, this, how can arbitral institutions offset their overall emissions? So that we can imagine that they can develop some kind of plan like Freshfields or any other companies, you know, to measure their carbon emission and to offset them in quality and approved programs. But what about going back to the model procedural order that is recommended in the green protocols that were developed by the campaign? Is there a way that we can imagine whereby the arbitrators could, you know, easily and practically, when they discuss green measures with their, you know, with the parties in an arbitral proceedings, where they could say, okay, so we are still going to have to travel to Singapore, we're still going to have 50 people, and we're still going to have, I don't know how many pages of documents printed, you know, for this proceeding, because for whatever reason it is still necessary. Can we all agree to offset this basically through some programs? And I know you're not arbitration, you know, specialist, but what kind of recommendation would you make, you know, to the arbitration community, you know, to deal with that basically?
The one way that arbitration is no different than any other emission producing event activity company is, you know, you have to basically follow 3 steps: measure, reduce when you can, offset when you can't. So if you can measure the emissions of individual arbitration proceedings, or if you can come up with some benchmarks or some estimates, and then you can reduce that by having it either be all virtual or maybe a portion of the folks who would have been there in person actually stay at home and are virtual. That's the reduction piece. And then what you can't reduce, then you move into looking to high quality offset projects. That 3-step measure, reduce, offset is the same whether you're talking about an event or a company's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, or really any way to approach confronting climate change from a corporate perspective.
Right. So, and then I understand, and the mitigate, you know, the reduce basically is the recommended measures in the green protocols, you know, for the arbitral proceedings, and I'll refer everyone back to that because it has some very practical recommendations on how to do that. If we still have to offset basically what we cannot reduce, and maybe I'll direct that question to Jessica, who has appeared on the screen. Like what could we imagine in the arbitration community to make it easy? Jessica, you are an arbitrator. If you are faced with that kind of situation, you've discussed basically the green model procedural order with the parties. You've agreed that you would be doing the procedural hearing remotely, but that for some reason the merits hearing has to take place in person, that you have to have 30 people travel to the hearing for 3 weeks. How, you know, what would make it easy in your shoes basically to offset what you cannot reduce?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think probably getting down to first principles would be really trying to understand attribution from the outset. Which carbon emissions are mine? Which carbon emissions properly belong to the to the council, to the parties, to the institution. And I think that having an understanding of that from the outset, and for parties, for example, that should probably be driven by counsel when they are consulting with their parties at the outset and agreeing the procedural order, something that could follow naturally if you're considering a green procedural order and you are minded to ensure that the proceedings are carbon neutral. I think that where a lot of confusion comes in is whose emissions are they? You're the arbitrator. Of course, you're going to have, as the arbitrator, you're going to have certain emissions that are attributable to you, and as an institution, you will as well. But probably being in a leadership position, you should probably be driving, be able to drive the arbitration and be able to inform the parties as to what the options are in terms of selecting different types of programs that they can use to offset their emissions. So I think that having more education around attribution, and then also having more of, having the understanding of the green protocol being a bit more widespread, so that it becomes part of the conversation at the outset of an arbitration, would be very helpful to, having people turn their minds to this very early in the proceedings, and ensuring that this can be implemented where emissions are not going to be avoidable, because the circumstances of the case are such that an in-person hearing and international travel are deemed necessary. So it's a question that I have, and really just an open question really to the panel, just about attribution and what the best way when you have multiple different parties who are interacting and bringing themselves together in something like an arbitration hearing. What is the best way for the parties to get together and understand how to attribute the carbon emissions in order to render the proceeding carbon neutral?
Maybe I'll pipe in here just a bit, and others can pick it up. I'm not very familiar how these types of events are organized, but potentially one way to look at it is through the financials, like who is responsible for the spend for different activities, potentially is one way to allocate those emissions for sure.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, and I think that's one of the things that are always actually considered at the end of an arbitration. Our costs are usually deliberated at the very end, so it may be something that could be contemplated at the outset and then actually attributed at the very end of the proceeding during a cost phase. Yeah, something certainly to consider. We have another question from the audience, which is from Kevin Setiati again. He asks, what kind of skills would you suggest that young lawyers have, or young arbitrators, or even law students? What kind of skills should they master during the energy transition, I guess, in order to completely understand what their carbon emissions are, what offsetting is, and how this will impact their careers? So I will happily hand this over to anyone in the panel if you'd like to jump in.
Yeah, this is Chris. I might add a couple of comments on that. I think understanding that inevitably sort of carbon trading, carbon markets are inevitably tied up with politics in some sense, and there's always some political dimension to how the regulations are set and therefore how the markets evolve. So appreciating the nuances of regulatory policy when it comes to carbon markets is important. I think second, just sort of understanding that at some level, these are not, they're fundamentally simple in concept, right? Giving economics incentives in order to reduce emissions, right? So if you've taken basic microeconomics and you can draw a supply and demand curve, that's most of what you need to understand how these markets function at a high level. And then I think third as well, that this is still a process that is evolving. Carbon markets are not fixed and they're not static today. And I expect that 10 years down the road, I would probably be saying the same thing, and that at least this is a long-term problem to solve, and that each incremental step kind of gets us closer to decarbonizing. But there is sort of not, an appreciation of the fact that these are evolving. People are sort of figuring out how this is going to work, and over time, these markets will change. And changing markets and changing regulations have been a good source of business for many of us over the years. But appreciating that that's how these markets will evolve is I think important.
And I spend a lot of my days, in contract law on the project side and for the actual offtake agreements from companies. At a very fundamental level. For example, with land, you're talking. You need some real estate lawyers at the table, for example, to figure out how we're going to treat the land and what easements are going on it. If you can't really build a wind farm without having a lot of lawyers involved and contract law and basic questions around delivery and risks. Carbon projects don't just happen in 1 year. To Mikey's point, could be 5, 10, 20, 50 years. And legally, how are we accounting for the ownership and ensuring all those hallmarks that I mentioned in a quality carbon offset are adhered to, monitored, verified, and issued on a regular basis? So there's kind of lots of different angles that we would be kind of working with the legal community at large, and hopefully everything goes really well and we don't need to go into any type of arbitration. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen sometimes in the market.
If I can just pick up on one thing Altera said, which I thought was a fantastic point, from a legal practitioner point of view, anything written into a contract today will almost certainly be operating under a different set of policies 10 years hence, 20 years hence. And I've lost count of the number of energy industry contracts I've seen where the regulatory policy has changed, the definition of indices has changed. Whatever is written into a contract today will inevitably be overtaken by events in the future. So having an appreciation that there is going to be massive regulatory change, it isn't not a question of if that will happen, but to what extent and when, is something to think about when sort of contemplating entering agreements.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of your comments. I would just reiterate, I think the best place to start is really to get an understanding of the Paris Agreement. And there are a lot of sources where you can get a breakdown of, what countries have committed to, what they committed to in 2015. It's on the UNFCCC website. I think we could probably put that into the chat. And then to understand, to be able to track what the evolving commitments are and the changing regulatory environment that Chris alluded to. You can see this in the series of statements that are made around the different COPs that happen each year. And so COP26 just happened in November of last year. We have another one coming up this year. And there you see the commitments that are made that are then implemented into the domestic law. And that's another place where you can kind of track how things are changing, how countries are changing their energy policy in particular in order to align their policies with commitments made under the Paris Agreement. So I would always say that the UNFCCC website is probably the best place to start, and they have a lot of very helpful information to get a foot in and understand the way that and the direction that the regulation is going.
And for young practitioners, arbitration practitioners in particular, I would add, of course, and we are at the end of our webinar. So this is like an advice that I think is valid for everyone. That I would like to remind everyone is to become very familiar with the green protocols that the campaign has drafted, and become very familiar with these and be, imaginative about the procedural aspects of arbitration, and question, how it can be done differently, and better and more efficiently, not only greener, but also more efficiently and cost effectively. And I think that young practitioners have really like a role to play when it comes to that. You are more familiar with technology, and technology, as we've heard, can be used very efficiently to do things differently and in a more sustainable way. So stay tuned with that. So I think it is now time to leave this webinar. So I would like to thank really all of you for attending. Of course, thank our excellent speakers for their enlightenments today. It's a complex topic, and we are very grateful to you for stepping into our world for 1 hour of your time to shed some lights on all of this. This is just the beginning of the conversation for the international arbitration communities, and we hope that we can get better at adopting more sustainable behaviors. And I would like, of course, to thank again all the supporting organizations for this event, and particularly the New York International Arbitration Center and Reka Rangashari for hosting us so brilliantly today. So thank you all, and have a great end of your day. Jessica, I will also let you, pardon me, I will also let you say a few words of goodbye.
Olivia, you put it brilliantly. I have nothing to add, except to thank our panel again, and thank Reka for her brilliant hosting duties and for putting all the links in. It was very helpful. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope we were able to, start to clarify a little bit this very complicated area, and help you take some first steps towards understanding carbon offsets and offsetting your emissions in your work. Thank you very much.